I'm here with John Englander, who is the author of High Tide on Main Street, The Rising Sea Levels and Coming Coastal Crisis. John, thank you for making the time to be with us today. Just how high is that tide going to be?
Well, it's going to keep rising for centuries. So the question is, how high will it rise? How soon is the first one. And the truth is, we don't know because we don't know how quickly the Antarctic ice sheet is going to collapse, as well as Greenland. But we're going to get a meter of sea level rise and then more. The question is, again, just how quickly. But the second problem is that as sea level rises and will not recede for a long, long time, hundreds of years, thousands of years, the next storm or extreme daily tide or the runoff event from rainfall all get worse as well. Because sea level is the base. We tend not to think of that. It's been pretty stable for a few thousand years. But it will get higher because the ice is melting with the warmer planet.
I don't think people really fully take this on board, do they, yet? But, obviously sea level rises, coastal areas get inundated. I mean, by the end of this century, any idea about how much land we're going to lose?
It depends upon the profile of the land. Places where land is fairly steep, like most of Hong Kong, on the island, steep terrain, it's not going to go too high up. But where the land is very low, particularly reclaimed land here on the waterfront, or up in the Pearl River Delta, where there's much shallower or lower slopes, it's going to go far inland. In fact, the ratio globally is 300 to 1. For every meter of sea level rise, you're going to get 300 meters back, which sounds surprising. But it's not right at the coast because sea level finds its way to the lowlands behind the coast even, or up tidal rivers. So it has a surprising effect.
When we talk about vulnerable delta areas in Asia, I mean, that's where it's really, really going to be felt. And, you're already seeing this in Bangladesh, for example.
It's all over the world. Jakarta has a tremendous problem because they're taking groundwater out and the land's subsiding. They've had 3 meters of sea level rise in the last 30 years because the land is going down. Tokyo is similar, but in different places because of the land subsiding, it'll be worse. But from Bangladesh, where it's very shallow, the marshland, to parts of Hong Kong, to parts of Thailand, the islands in the Pacific, we always look at the Maldives and the Marshall Islands and Kiribati. These places have extreme vulnerability. They'll disappear in the next century or two. And that's really surprising.
We're at a conference here looking at urban adaptation to climate change, but actually the sort of adaptation that will have to take place to accommodate that level of sea rise is, for a number of places, they just have to move the city, I guess.
Well, move the city in some cases, but in many cases it's really elevate their construction techniques and come up with bolder techniques. What's trouble to think about with sea level rise is it's been pretty stable for a few thousand years.
As long as we can remember.
Well, about 5,000 years it's been stable. If you look at the Ice Age cycles, it was 110 meters lower, 120 meters lower actually, 20,000 years ago. So we have no memory of that, although we do have various tales of the flood and so on, about 14,000 years ago when sea level rose dramatically. But for recent time it hasn't changed. But as sea level rises now, and it will because the ice sheets are melting, the next event of a storm or a rainfall event, and these other things are on top of it again. So it kind of challenges because it's two different time scales. Sea level won't go down for centuries. And so it's effectively permanent flooding, as opposed to a typhoon or some other event that comes in, washes out, and then recedes, and you can rebuild. Sea level won't recede. So it challenges us to think differently.
So are we going to become a more aquatic species, or are we just going to have to live more on top of each other as we do in Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong the city of the future, in fact?
Well, in some ways it is. We are going to live more densely, and in some ways it's easier to adapt in urban areas to this long-term sea level rise than it is in rural areas. Even though it's expensive real estate and expensive construction, it's probably easier to take a dense city like Hong Kong and plan for the next 100 years, which housing lasts 100 years today, typically, and infrastructure certainly lasts 100 years, to begin thinking about how to adapt to this ever-rising sea level, which will make storm surge even worse.
You come from the US, you're used to talking to US audiences where I presume this pitch is a bit more of a bit harder to make. In Asia, climate change denial is almost non-existent. But what's your feeling? I mean, how are people coming to grips with this?
Year by year, more people are accepting that not only is climate change happening, but that humans are a contributor to it. Politically, we have some problems, but they really relate, even though they seem like denial of climate change, they're really, what do we do about it? Do we get off of coal? Do we use tar sands? Do we go back to nuclear? All these energy questions, because they have huge impact economically. And when you really peel back the layers of concern, it's often, well, okay, what do we do about it, and who's going to tell us what to do? Is the answer regulation from the United Nations? Is it from the federal government? That's what really is behind a lot of the concerns when you really kind of peel back the layers of the onion, as it were.
If you look around, the cities of the world and this particular problem, rising sea levels, can you point to any as an example of actually this city's really got its act together and it's doing the right things?
I don't think anybody's there yet. There are cities that are starting to look at it. Certainly the Netherlands has a history of reclaiming land from the sea, but even there, they hadn't anticipated sea level rise very much. The big famous gates at Rotterdam Harbor, those two giant clamshell-like gates that weren't designed for enough sea level rise. Now they realize the design's inadequate, even though it cost them $1 billion US just 20-some years ago. They were designing for river flooding and storms. Now that they realize sea level will rise 1 meter and then 2 meters, they need to kind of rebuild those at some point. So that was an expensive, if you will, mistake, because they didn't anticipate sea level rise adequately. The London Barrage is now being closed far more often than it used to be. And now they're looking at how high a sea level will it accommodate. And there's some new ideas on how to adapt that without having to replace it. Cities from Boston to Miami to San Francisco in the United States, but globally are looking at issues about how do we adapt to ever-rising sea level, because it's confused with storm surge, which is a sudden, quick event. If you get 1 meter or 2 or 3 of storm surge, but it recedes, we tend to prepare for that. Sea level just comes creeping along at centimeters at a time, but doesn't go down. So like in our culture, the proverbial tortoise that wins the race is a fable. I don't know if it is here or not, but between the hare and the tortoise, we tend to be looking at the hare that moves quickly and jumps, but it's the tortoise that just ploddingly moves along that's going to win that race in the fable. And in sea level rise, it's kind of the same thing against storm surge. It's the slow and steady that's the bigger problem, and we don't tend to look at it.
John Englander, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Fergus.